Hello, today in Social Problems, we'll be discussing inequality, specifically focusing on poverty and wealth within our society. So what is inequality and how does it affect people? Well, when we define economic inequality, we have to take into consideration that we have a tendency as human beings to categorize or rank things. We want to make distinctions between a city or a song or a book. We want to make distinctions between the different social classes and types of opportunities that are afforded to individuals within our society. In the field of sociology, we call this social stratification. And social stratifications focus on how do we begin to rank individuals and what are the rewards and opportunities afforded to those individuals based on a certain criteria. For example, looking at wealth and power or prestige. We can also look at educational attainment, for example, as a way to rank individuals or even the prestige of an occupation. And we'll talk about that later on in this course. When we talk about social stratification, we're looking also at the inequality that is created. This struggle between the have and have-nots, what Karl Marx talks about being the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie being the wealthy factory owners and the proletariat being the workers. And the idea that Karl Marx, who is the godfather of conflict theory, talks about this constant struggle and that the haves or the bourgeoisie are always trying to find ways to maximize profit. And they do that by manipulating the have-nots, the proletariats, and they accomplish that also by exploiting the labor of the proletariats. This idea that this inequality within our society can lead to greater social problems. Think about it. Think about how many individuals today live at or near poverty level. Think about how many individuals are struggling with homelessness. And remember, homelessness is not exclusive to only living out on the streets, but also includes any type of housing insecurity, such as sleeping on someone's couch or floor, bouncing from friends or neighbor's house to friends or neighbor's house, living in a hotel or motel for a specific period of time, living in a car. Think about how inequality today, perhaps lack of access to resources, right? An education system that has consistently failed generations and generations of students. How expensive it is to rent a home or to own a home, particularly in the city of Los Angeles. You want to take all this into consideration when we talk about social stratification, because it begins to help us understand, well, why is our society ranked in a particular way? Why do we stratify individuals in a particular way? Right? What qualifies as wealth? What qualifies as income in our society? And how does that lead to how we rank individuals? See, in the United States, we typically subscribe to this philosophy that the wealthier you are, the more important you must be in the eyes of others. Well, that's not necessarily true. Wealth should not determine how people view you favorably or disapprove of you. But that's what we typically subscribe to within our society. You think about other societies where birth status and family origin play a role. The idea that in these societies, privileged positions may be reserved for individuals who hold the rank of nobility. And so you want to take that into consideration, that although we don't necessarily have a degree of nobility or a king or queen or princess in the United States, we do have families that carry with them a considerable amount of influence and power. Names such as the Kennedys, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, individuals who were very important in building the country to what it is today. And they enjoy this celebrity status because of their level of public acknowledgement, their level of power, and of course, their level of wealth. Now, in the United States, when we talk about access to wealth and income, we have to understand what qualifies under the income bracket and what qualifies under the wealth bracket. When we talk about income, we're referring to money that's received for work or through some type of investments. When you get your paycheck every week, every 2 weeks, every month, that's a form of income. When investments in the stock market pay dividends, that qualifies as income. When we talk about wealth, we're talking about all of your material possessions. What is the value of all your material possessions, including your income? So think about your house, think about your car, think about all the electronics you own, think about jewelry, think about clothes, etc. If we were to place a value on each and every one of those, and we were to add up that value, what would your wealth, aka net worth, be? Chances are, in most cases, our wealth far exceeds our income because our wealth is an accumulation. Our wealth takes place over a series of years, right? Income, yes, we have our annual income, but we typically live based on our income for a particular month, 2 weeks, or 1 week period. Now, what we want to understand is that in the United States, we have individuals who are struggling, individuals who are living off minimum wage. And remember, minimum wage is not a livable wage. Minimum wage is the minimum compensation that you're provided for performing certain job tasks. And we see this disparity in low-income workers as opposed to high-powered executives who receive 6 or 7-figure salaries, sometimes even more than that. And so to understand our population and to understand how income is distributed in the United States, sociologists and economists typically divide the population into what we call quintiles. And quintiles are 5 equal segments that account for about 20% of our population. And so we want to understand that these quintiles illustrate the fact that most Americans exist somewhere in between extreme wealth and extreme poverty. And so to understand this concept of extreme wealth, extreme poverty, we begin to introduce these concepts like the lower class or the underclass or the middle class or the upper middle class or the upper class to kind of help us understand this level of stratification that exists within our society. Now, what we want to understand is that in 2020, the highest quintile, the richest 20% of workers, earn 52.2% of the total household incomes in the United States. And within this bracket, within this quintile, the average income was about $253,000. Now let's compare that to the lowest quintile, the poorest 20% of the workforce. When you look at the incomes, the total household incomes earned by these workers within the lowest quintile, only 3% of the total household incomes in the United States occurred within this quintile. So we look at income distribution, and we're not going to go through all of this because you're able to view it in your notes and also on the screen, but to give you an idea of what are the average incomes that fall within each one of these quintiles. In the lowest quintile, we have $0 to $27,000. In the second lowest quintile, we have $27,000 to $52,000. In the middle quintile, we have $52,000 to $85,000. In the fourth or the second highest quintile, we have $85,000 to $141,000. And in the highest quintile, we have $141,000 and above. And so when you look at that, and you look at what is the average person actually earning at each quintile, you're able to see these numbers. 36,000 in the lowest, 43,000 the second lowest, 52,000 in the middle, 64,000 in the second highest, and at the highest quintile, the average household income per earner, we're not talking about per household, we're talking about per individual, is 126,000. And you're able to then look at a breakdown in marital status, age, work experience, and educational level. So you want to take all that into consideration as we go through this. Now, what we see here is how the median household income in the United States has been since 1990. And so you'll see that it goes up and then down, and then it climbs, and then it drops. And then it climbs a little bit, and then it drops significantly. In about 2000, from 2007 roughly to about 2012, we see a decrease in incomes within the family unit. Then we see a sharp spike, a decline, and since about 2014, we've seen an increase in wages until about 2020. And so what we want to understand is that the median income for the American family is about $67,000. Now, most families do not qualify for the $67,000. In fact, when we look at race and ethnicity, and we look at the median household income based on race and ethnicity, what you'll notice is that the members of the AAPI community have the highest median household income out of any group, compared to the African American community, which has the lowest. And so you want to take all that in consideration, because when we start to look at the different challenges and the different opportunities that exist based on race and ethnicity, well, the median household income actually plays a major role. Now, the income gap between the wealthy and the poor is widening, and income inequality continues to increase. We talked about wealth earlier, the income, the assets that we own. Do we have stocks? Do we hold bonds? Do we own real estate? How much cash do we have in our banks? In the United States, the top 1% of wealth holders have more total wealth than the entire bottom 90% of the population. I want you to think about it. The top 1% have more wealth than the bottom 90%. That can be shocking to some of us. And we wonder, what type of opportunities are people being deprived of by not having access to this wealth and these resources? And so you want to look at the significant gap that exists between those who control wealth and those who have no true wealth to control. And this can be caused by, for example, unequal inheritance issues. Think about it. Only about 1.6% of Americans receive over $100,000 or more in inheritance. The bottom 91.9% receive absolutely nothing. And so what happens a lot of times is that when money is passed from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next, it continues to accumulate. And it continues to stay roughly in the same place. And so you want to take that into consideration. When we look at income and wealth, they often also times bring with them access to power. And when we talk about power, power is a coercive element in society that manipulates people to do things that they may not otherwise do. See, power is the ability to get people to do what you want them to do without having to make them do so. But when we use force, for example, that's a form of power that occurs when you make someone do something against his or her will. We look at persuasive power. And persuasive power means that you use direct or indirect methods to get what you want. Right? Think about this. At times, it might be easier for people to get along and to follow along if they believe that following along is in their best interest. We look at persuasive power being shared by Oprah, for example, when she had her television show. Oprah was able to persuade her viewers to support books on her book club list. And based on that, many individuals became bestsellers. And if you recall, if you ever watched Oprah, Dr. Oz, Rachel Ray, Nate, I'm sorry, I don't remember his last name, who was the interior designer, Dr. Phil, and a wide variety of other individuals were able to build their careers off that exposure that Oprah provided them, because Oprah provided legitimacy to them. Oprah made them a household name. And that convinced individuals to, in some ways, subscribe, to buy into what these individuals were selling. Now, it's important to note, it is very difficult to convince someone that his or her long-standing ideas about an issue are not necessarily true. So what does that mean? Well, if you subscribe to the mentality that you believe that everyone has an equal chance to succeed, then you're persuaded to keep the system unchanged because you think the system is fair and you think the system is equal. What we know, based on today and historically, is that the system is not equal. That separate is not equal. That there are individuals in society who have more opportunities than others. I want you to think about it in this way. My son, he's 8 years old. His mom has a bachelor's degree. I have a bachelor's degree, about to finish my third master's, and I hold a doctorate. My son lives in an upper middle class family. We're homeowners. He goes to private school. My son will have advantages that other kids in our society will not have. And one of those advantages is cultural knowledge in regards to college and universities. Another advantage he's going to have is that he has a dad who is in education, who has worked at all different levels of education, and who understands and has certain expectations for educational institutions, so that if the school he currently attends begins to underperform, I can easily move him to another institution that is operating at the academic level that I need it to be operating at. Most families don't have that luxury. Most families don't have that opportunity. Most families have to attend schools within their district, within their neighborhoods, and they pray and they hope that that school is doing well and that school's overperforming. So you want to take that in consideration, because we assume that the playing field is equal, but we know that the playing field is not equal. Case in point, the opportunities that my son has compared to opportunities that other kids may have, right? Then we look at prestige. What level of esteem is associated with your status and your social standing? See, different jobs have different levels of prestige, for example. And so occupations are generally ranked on a scale of 0 to 100, with 0 having the least amount of esteem and 100 having the most amount of esteem. Prestige. Typically, what we find is that the lower the paying job, the less prestige it holds. Okay, but who's doing the ranking? Who's doing the interpretation? We want to take that into consideration. Who is more valuable? The individual who is a medical doctor? You can argue there's a lot of prestige there. Or the individual who picks up garbage every week? Well, think about how often you go see a medical doctor. Might go for your yearly checkup. You may go see your doctor when you're feeling very ill, but for the most part, you don't really have a whole lot of interaction with your doctor. But think about how much interaction you have, perhaps even indirectly, with the person who picks up the trash every week. If that person fails to do their job, what begins to occur? Your neighborhood begins to smell. You see more and more rodents, more opportunities for disease to develop. So I want you to think about that, because most individuals will argue that it's more prestigious to be a medical doctor. Okay. But who's doing the evaluation? Who's more important? And I'm not saying that someone picking up trash is more important than a doctor or vice versa. What I'm saying is that we have to look at this very critically, right? Think about a pilot, right? Pilots make 6 figures on average. A person who has a career as an airline pilot may be viewed more in a more prestigious manner than individuals who are working minimum wage jobs. And so when we talk about occupational procedures, oftentimes, what does our society deem to be important? What does our society respect the most? Think about what our hopes and dreams are for those of us who are parents for our kids. Think about what our parents' hopes and dreams were or are for us. Right? Think about the sacrifices individuals have made throughout our lives to provide us an opportunity to be in a class studying sociology, right? To have that ability to work or not work, to have that ability to have some free time in order to not only complete our classes by attending them, but also to complete our assignments in order to excel in them, right? And we're doing this for a reason. Most of us are doing this so that we can get an AA degree and transfer, go to a 4-year university and graduate, and increase our earning potential. In addition, some of us are taking these courses so that we can complete a program of study, such as nursing, for example, that will allow us to develop a career in a select field, but also earn a very comfortable living, which further contributes to this concept of prestige, this concept of occupational prestige, when we finally achieve our career goals. We look at class in America, and we look at the upper class or the elite class. And this is a very small percentage of our population, right? We're looking about 3 million people, so less than 1% of the American population. We have old money. That's money that's been passed on from generation to generation, inheritance, for example. We have new money. Enormous amounts of money that have been earned by entertainers, athletes, entrepreneurs. They didn't inherit their money, they built their money. Now, when we're talking about the elites, when we're talking about the upper class, these individuals typically have access to the best schools. So the kids might be going to these exclusive prep schools, right? They might belong to certain country clubs or social clubs, right? And being born into a wealthy family or a family with means definitely paves an easier path for individuals, because you're not necessarily deprived of opportunity. You're not necessarily deprived of resources. We look at the upper middle class, and these are individuals who also earn high incomes. These are typically, but not always, individuals who are well educated, but may not necessarily have access to the elite membership that the super wealthy enjoy. These individuals tend to occupy a profession, a career with high prestige, and at times will hold authority within the workplace. These individuals typically have incomes that exceed $150,000 a year, which means that you're able to live comfortably, you're able to own property, you have disposable income if you must to make investments or to go on vacation or to invest in your children's education, whatever it may be. This is the upper middle class. The middle class is where most Americans believe they are, but most Americans do not qualify as middle class. Most Americans are working class or lower middle class. See, the middle class people have moderate incomes. These may be low-paid white-collar workers to very well-paid blue-collar workers. These individuals are skilled. They have a skill set, right? These individuals typically have some college, and most have at least a high school diploma. The middle class is shrinking in the United States, and it currently stands at 34% of the US population. And so you want to keep that in mind, because as we start to look at the working class, for example, that makes up about 30% of the US population. And these individuals typically also completed high school, but also have very little college. They may work in jobs that are more focused on manual labor, clerical skills, right? These are individuals who earn typically an hourly wage as opposed to the middle class, the upper middle class, and the elite class, which earns salaries. These individuals typically have limited opportunities for job improvements because of a lack of a formal education in the working class. Now, the lower class is approximately made of 37 million people. And these individuals are directly influenced by poverty. These are individuals that are typically living paycheck to paycheck, if they're employed at all. These are individuals that may be one flat tire away from not being able to pay their gas bill or being able to pay their rents. 2/3 of African Americans, 60% of Latinos, Hispanics fall into the category of the lower class because they live near or below the poverty line. Almost 50% of the children in the United States live at or near the poverty line, as well as 10% of seniors. Now understand, when we look at income, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, being $10 above what is defined as the poverty line won't qualify you as living in poverty. You will now be called low income, which may deprive you of certain resources. So you want to keep that in mind. And then we look at the urban underclass. And when we talk about the urban underclass, we're talking about people who experience homelessness and unemployment chronically, meaning that it's pretty persistent in their life. These are the truly impoverished. These are individuals who live in substandard housing, if they have housing at all. They go to schools that are poor schools, low performing schools. They may live in areas that are high crime and that have heavy drug use. These individuals typically receive some type of financial assistance from the US government. They typically don't have health care coverage. They typically don't have a high school education. These individuals may or may not work, and if they work, they may be working for minimum wage jobs. And so you want to also take into consideration how income can lead to segregation within neighborhoods, right? Think about wealthier or rich areas as compared to underclass, lower class, lower middle class, or working class neighborhoods. Typically night and day difference, right? See, schools in wealthier areas typically have more resources and they perform better, not 100% of the time, but it does occur. They typically have a lesser rate of teenage pregnancies, and on standardized tests, they have a higher standardized test score. Children growing up in disadvantaged communities may have lower birth rates, they may have poorer health, and they may have lower levels of education. When we look at health, and we tie social class standing to health. What you want to take into consideration is that poor women with children typically or frequently have insufficient diets. They suffer from higher rates of mental depression and have worse physical health than their wealthier counterparts because poverty influences our access to food. And food influences our physical and mental health. Think about it. When you go into the hood, what are you going to find? You're going to find fast food restaurants and you're going to find liquor stores. You don't see those things typically, at least not in the amount that we have in the hood, in wealthier areas like South Pasadena and San Marino. Think about the quality of food that we have access to in supermarkets. Think about how individuals are able to survive in an environment where the cost of groceries has climbed 10, 20, 30%, and how that influences their ability to afford certain foods. There's a lot of research that says that poorer people generally have poorer levels of health because of medical care and the lack of access to it. Homes that may not have glass on the windows, so cold breeze comes through. Homes with mold, for example. Kids might not have a bed to sleep on. That can affect their overall physical health. These are all things that you want to take into consideration when we talk about social class standing and health. Those with the higher socioeconomic status typically have greater health, not 100% of the time, but overall, as a whole. You think about the educational attainment of children who are consistently sick, for example. As adults, they typically have less education than adults from a higher socioeconomic status because they missed a lot of school being ill, and then they might also miss a lot of work being ill. You want to take all that into consideration. You want to take into consideration the family unit. The idea that the US Census Bureau draws a correlation between a family unit and poverty rates. Female-headed households have higher poverty rates that are 3 times higher than the national rate for all families. Female poverty rates are also higher than the rates for households headed by a single man. Since the 1970s, the poverty rate for children under the age of 18 has been higher than the poverty rate for any other age bracket. And think about how that affects life circumstances. We talked about the quality of housing. We talked about access to food and quality food. The idea that a large percentage of children in the United States qualify for free or reduced lunch. So for many of these students, the only meals that they're eating are breakfast and lunch. You want to take that into consideration because being hungry in school affects a student's ability to learn. You have to think about how poverty may lead individuals at times to have to work multiple shifts and or multiple jobs. So is the kid getting the attention that he or she needs? Are kids being forced to grow up faster than other kids their age because their family is not as well off? Children make up about 36% of all people living in poverty. Yet only make up 25% of the total population in the United States. What we've seen here is that in recent years, the federal government has attempted to aggressively address the issue of single-parent households by attempting to curb the non-marital pregnancy rates and stressing the importance of children growing up in a two-parent household. We talk about privilege in sociology, and it's a privilege to grow up in a two-parent household. And although a two-parent household might seem ideal at times, it may not necessarily always be the healthiest situation for individuals, especially if there's a lot of arguing, especially if there's a lot of abuse taking place. See, what the US government and individuals who hold these traditional family concepts don't realize is that the family and the family unit can be defined in multiple ways. The family unit can be defined as two fathers, two mothers. The family unit can be defined as a single father or single mother. The family unit can be defined as individuals who live together who don't have children. And to assume that, well, if we have a two-parent household, that's going to solve all the issues of poverty or financial struggle is absurd. Yes, it may ease the burden for some families, but for other families, the cycle of poverty may continue. And you want to take that in consideration. Because two-parent households historically have higher incomes than female-headed households or single-parent households. That's true. But that's not in 100% of cases. And what happens to those families that remain in a single-parent household? What type of support, what type of resources can we provide them with? We look at education, and in the United States, we provide a free education for at least 12 years to every child, regardless of their family or their class, social class standing. But not all educational opportunities are the same, and I mentioned that before. Lower schools in lower income communities may not have the resources that are necessary. You might walk into a chemistry class and you see no instruments that are actually applicable to the field of chemistry. No test speakers, no test tubes. Students might be sharing textbooks. As I shared in my other classes, I can't tell you how many times I've been sent photos or I've had conversations with parents about the textbooks that their kids receive. The textbooks are older than their son or their daughter. The textbooks are held together by duct tape. I want you to think about that. Duct tape holding a textbook together is absolutely ridiculous. How do you inspire a child to learn when you tell that child, we're not willing to invest in your education? Think about it. That textbook was not just tossed in a pile and then all of a sudden the kid walks over and pulls a book out of the pile. That textbook was handed to that student. Someone intentionally handed that student a textbook held together by duct tape, despite seeing that textbook held by duct tape. When you visit some schools that are being built today, especially in low-income neighborhoods, those schools look like damn prisons. You walk around that school, there's concrete everywhere. Damn, even the backboards are stainless steel with metal chains at times. You walk around some of these campuses, there's so much gray there, and then you look up and you see a camera pointing down. How's that supposed to inspire a student to learn when you're conditioning that student to feel as if they're already in prison? And think about that. Think about students in higher income communities. They might have a lot of trees, a lot of grass. Their buildings are colorful. They have brick. They have staircases that look like they came out of a Disney film. You think about the resources, you think about the supplies, you think about the staff, you think about everything that's accessible to students from wealthier families. Right? Think about the structure of the education system. Think about how property taxes affect educational funding. If you're in a community where there aren't a whole lot of property owners, there's more rental properties, or the homes are of lesser value, well, not as many taxes are being generated to support schools in that area. And so you want to take that into conclusion. You want to take into conclusion, not into conclusion, into consideration. Sorry. You want to take into consideration that education inequality does not exist in the United States. We look at this concept of social mobility, and social mobility focuses on horizontal and vertical mobility. And horizontal mobility is when you occupy the same status, but you might change occupations, or you might change your workplace. For example, if you're a paralegal at law firm A, and then you become a paralegal at law firm B, you're performing the same task, you're earning the same money. Vertical mobility applies to when you move up from a social status to another. So were a paralegal at law firm A, and now you've gone to law school, you graduated, you passed the bar exam, now you're a lawyer at law firm B. You climb a social status, you enter a new socioeconomic bracket. We look at intragenerational mobility. When an individual is able to change their social standing, especially in a workforce. Where an individual started off in the mailroom and through hard work and experience, they were able to rise up to the ranks of a senior executive. Intergenerational mobility refers to the change that family members make from one social class to the next through generations. For example, your parents, my parents, our grandparents, right, created opportunities for us. And because of those opportunities, we're going to be able to rise up the social ranking system. We may have grown up in a family that was low income. And guess what? Through education, through hard work, through opportunity, we're now able to break into the middle class or the upper middle class or the upper elite class. And that's what intergenerational mobility is. You do better than the previous generation. We look at structural mobility. When social changes cause people to change their social status simultaneously. Well, what does that mean? Well, think about it. You might be a member of the upper middle class and you lose your job, and now you're a member of the working class or even lower. Or you're a member of the underclass or the lower class, and an opportunity presents itself, and all of a sudden you skyrocket to the middle class or upper middle class. You think about jobs being outsourced, sent overseas. You're seeing jobs being consolidated or occupations being consolidated. You see some fields going obsolete, for example. And that begins to change individuals' socioeconomic status. We look at this concept of exchange mobility. And what that means is that for the most part, our social classes remain relatively the same. Now, we might lose, 5% coming from the upper middle class to the middle class, but then we also might see a 5% gain from the middle class to the upper middle class. So they pretty much remain even, a fixed number. And how do we begin to define poverty? Well, sociologists define poverty through 5 different categories. We have transitional poverty, right? That's a temporary state of poverty that occurs when a person goes out without a job for a short period of time, right? It's temporary when we talk about transitional poverty. Marginal poverty is when an individual lacks stable employment, right? A handyman or handywoman, for example, who bounces between jobs. Today, they may be living comfortably, but next month they may not be. Residual poverty refers to chronic multi-generational poverty. That's when poverty is passed from one generation to the next. And that cycle of poverty isn't broken. We have absolute poverty, which refers to poverty so severe that an individual lacks the most basic necessities of life. And relative poverty is when we look at what other people have and we evaluate our own lives. Well, what exactly does that mean? Well, we look at, hey, that person has the latest car, that person has the latest iPhone. I don't have that. I must be poor. Right? It's not a fact, it's just a thought process. Now, how do we define poverty? Well, the US government has a benchmark known as the poverty line. And individuals who fall below that poverty line may be eligible to receive low cost and no cost healthcare, subsidies for food, and career aid from the government. And here's just a chart of what qualifies as living in poverty in the United States. As I mentioned before, if you make slightly above, for example, $26,500 for a family of four, you may not be considered as living in poverty anymore. You may be considered as low income, which can reduce your access to no cost to low cost healthcare, can significantly reduce your access to government subsidies, particularly for food. We look at the welfare system, and it was set up as an entitlement program to provide assistance to individuals. In '96, Bill Clinton introduces the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. Within this policy, the Temporary Assistance to Needy Families program was created. This drastically changed the welfare system because it basically placed limits on how much welfare an individual could receive and how long they were qualified for. Well, you want to think about this. You might have a window of 2 to 5 years to receive this aid, but that might not be enough to break that cycle of poverty. An individual might work hard every single day of their life, but still be trapped in the cycle of poverty. These changes to the policy didn't take that into consideration. They were focused on the small percentage of individuals who were abusing the system, as opposed to the large percentage of individuals who just needed an additional helping hand and were doing everything in their power to earn for their families. And so you want to take that into consideration. See, the TANF wanted to focus on job training. The idea was, well, let's get people a higher education. Let's increase their work skills because, well, they're going to get better paying jobs. Unfortunately, for most people, the program only lasted 2 years. And that's not enough time for someone to get a college degree. That's not enough time at times for people to receive adequate training. And just because you went from living in welfare, receiving welfare, to earning additional wages doesn't mean you're receiving a living wage. Take this into consideration. Approximately 79% of minimum wage earners in the United States are older than the age of 25 years old. Now, let's look at the different philosophies of the US welfare system. We have what we call residual welfare. And this is meant for individuals who need a helping hand, who need some relief, even though they have earnings from a job, but those earnings are not enough to support them. It's temporary aid. Then we also have what we call institutional welfare. And this is basically the first line of defense against poverty. The assistance that's offered is for preventative measures. There's no time limit imposed. And there's really no social stigma associated with it. Then we look at taxation. And remember, taxes are used to pave our roads, to build and maintain our parks, to help fund our schools, our firefighters, law enforcement, and the military. In the United States, we have what we call progressive taxation and regressive taxation. Typically, what happens in a progressive tax system, people who earn more pay more in taxes. In a regressive taxation system, what we find is that technically everyone's charged the same percentage of money. However, this actually means that the poor pay a higher percentage than the rich do. Think about it. The impact of a 7% sales tax on your monthly income. Does a 7% sales tax, or tax, I should say, or 7% tax on goods that you purchase, how does that affect your life being in a middle-class family as opposed to being in an elite or an upper-class family, right? Yes, upper-class family might say, well, we made $3 million a year, we paid $300,000 in taxes. You made $50,000 a year and you paid $18,000 in taxes. Okay, that's true. But your 10% equaled 300,000. My 10% should have equaled 5,000, but I'm paying 18,000. That affects my life more than it affects yours being in the upper elite class. So you want to take that in consideration when we look at a regressive taxation. We look at functionalism. And functionalism basically says that people should be enticed to work harder to earn higher incomes, right? That we have occupations that need to be filled, so we are going to have those people at the top and those people at the bottom. Functionalists talk about this concept of meritocracy, that if you work hard and you learn the skills and you learn the education, you'll be rewarded. Well, that's not necessarily always true, because it assumes that everyone in our society receives a promotion or a job with occupational prestige simply for working hard. We look at conflict theory. And conflict theory says meritocracy is broken, that our world is unequal, that individuals who come from higher income families have a lot more opportunities than individuals from lower income families, that our world is not equal. We do not have an equitable playing field, that we need to take into consideration the impact of racism and sexism and homophobia, classism, that all create significant barriers. And then we look at symbolic interactionism. What is the meaning that we give to inequality? What is the meaning that we give to social problems? Do we have a tendency to blame the victim? You want to take that into consideration, because we point the finger at individuals who are living in poverty. We say, well, only if you worked hard enough, not realizing that that person has worked hard their entire lives. The opportunity itself just hasn't presented itself yet. And that concludes this chapter.